All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to go ahead and get started. As folks join, please feel free to introduce yourself by sharing your name, your organization, and where you're located in the chat box. And welcome to our first town hall in our series. My name is Sona Monat, and I'm a senior policy analyst with the Greenlining Institute. Thank you so much for joining us for this first town hall in our series, hosted by Greenlining Institute, APEN, Scope, and California ReLeaf. We're all very excited to have you here with us today for a timely conversation on COVID and climate change, centering equity and response and recovery to support resilient communities. So to get started, I want to share a few Zoom housekeeping items and the agenda for our discussion today. So for Zoom, I'd like to ask all of you to first, please add your name, organization, and preferred pronouns on your Zoom screen. And you can do this by hovering over your screen and you'll see 3 little dots. And when you click on that, you'll have an option to rename yourself. Second, please keep yourself muted during the presentations. Third, feel free to use the chat box throughout the event for any questions or comments that you have. And finally, if you have any technical issues that come up, please send a message to Ryan Burbridge using the chat feature. So let's go ahead and jump into the agenda. So for today's town hall, we'll start off by introducing our speakers and sharing some context for this series. Then we'll have our first presentation on establishing an Office of Racial Equity, followed by a breakout discussion. We'll then transition to our second presentation on equitable green investments that will be followed by another breakout discussion. Going to go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. So today we have an excellent panel of experts from multiple organizations who will guide our presentations and discussions and help us unpack the intersections between COVID and the climate crisis and share recommendations to address both crises. So from the Greenlining Institute, we have myself and Alvaro Sanchez, the director of the Environmental Equity Team. From the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, we have Ami Raval, who is a research director at APEN. Next, we have Tiffany Wong, who is a policy and research associate at SCOPE, or Strategic Concepts in Organizing and Policy Education. And finally, from California ReLeaf, we have Mariela Ruacho, who is the Policy and Education Strategy Program Manager, and Chuck Mills, the Director of Public Policy and Grants at California ReLeaf. So to kick us off, I'd like to provide some context for this series and what we're hoping to achieve. So the past 7 months have been extremely challenging, from the beginning of shelter in place, to physical distancing to slow the spread of COVID, to racial justice protests around the country and the world to reckon with the ongoing police brutality and racialized violence towards our Black communities. And finally, most recently, to extreme heat waves and devastating wildfires that are continuing to engulf the state. This past year is really showing us what happens when multiple crises intersect and is underscoring how critical the need is for comprehensive strategies that can address the public health, economic, and climate crises that our communities are enduring, especially for our Black, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian American, and Pacific Islander communities that continue to be hit hardest by climate disasters and are now also being hit hardest by COVID, with disproportionate mortality rates, lack of access to testing, and high rates of job loss. Overlapping policy failures are one of the primary reasons why communities of color and low-income communities are being hit hardest by COVID and climate change today. The conditions that made our communities vulnerable to the virus in the first place are a direct result of decades of historic and systemic racist policies and practices like redlining, that have left our communities with extremely high levels of air pollution, poor infrastructure, a lack of green open space, poor health, and economic insecurity. And so it's no accident or surprise that our frontline communities are being impacted at such disproportionate rates. And over the past few months, it's become more and more clear that we need to think simultaneously and holistically about the multiple crises and threats that our communities are facing, and ask ourselves, how can we support our frontline communities now in the face of COVID and climate change, while at the same time thinking about solutions that can create long-term, sustainable, and equitable systems change to address the root causes of these crises? And so the reason we're bringing you all here today for this series is so that we can work towards a just recovery in our communities and I wanted to share a definition for just recovery developed by the movement generation. The just recovery that we want to see is one that resists disaster capitalism that is oppressive and exploitative, and instead focuses on disaster collectivism that models people-powered, heart-centered, socially just relief and organizing and actions that reclaim the right of people to define their economies and govern their communities. And so in light of this, earlier this summer, Greenlining, APEN, Scope, and California ReLeaf developed recommendations for a just COVID-19 response and recovery to support resilient communities. We submitted this letter to the Governor's Task Force on Business and Jobs Recovery, and more than 100 organizations supported the letter, including many of the organizations here today. The letter includes a comprehensive set of principles and specific equity-centered recommendations in response to COVID and climate change. And the graphic that I have on this slide provides an overview of the recommendations we developed. And you'll notice that all of the recommendations fall into three main categories: making equity real, strategic green investments, and achieving economic resilience and recovery. And by focusing on meeting this triple bottom line of racial equity, equitable green investments, and economic recovery, we hope to advance systemic transformation and meaningfully address the multiple needs and concerns of our priority communities as we begin to recover from COVID and continue to address the climate crisis. And so of the multiple recommendations that we developed, we wanted to focus and hone in on the recommendations that have been gaining the most traction with the Governor's Task Force. And those recommendations will be the topics that we discuss at each town hall. For today's town hall, we'll focus on establishing an Office of Racial Equity and Equitable Green Investments. In 2 weeks, on October 6th, we'll discuss safe transportation recommendations and a proposal to create a mapping platform to identify communities most vulnerable to climate change. And finally, at our last town hall on October 20th, we'll focus on recommendations for workforce development and closing the digital divide. And if you'd like to learn about the other recommendations we developed, you can find them in the full letter that we sent to the Governor's Task Force, and I'll include a link to that letter in the chat box in just a moment. Before we move into our first presentation, I want to lastly share what our goals are for this series. In the short term, we hope that by the end of the series, you'll have a strong understanding of the 6 recommendations we'll be discussing, an opportunity to offer your thinking and input to the recommendations, and to share priorities that you're all working on that aim to advance racial equity, equitable green investments, and economic recovery. And second, in the long term, we'd love to build on the work we do together through these town halls, stay in touch with all of you, and see if there are any policy or funding opportunities in 2021 where we can collectively advance our recommendations and have a real chance at building a just, sustainable, and resilient California. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Alvaro Sanchez, who will present on the Office of Racial Equity proposal.
Thank you, Sona, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Really looking forward to discussing all of our proposals with you over the next coming weeks. But to get started, I want to talk to you about our proposal to establish an Office of Racial Equity. Unfortunately, we now know that our economy is running on an engine of white supremacy and forced inequality, and COVID-19 has illuminated that in the most vicious way possible. This pandemic is exposing all of the inequities in our country, and is clearly demonstrating that we belong to a larger, interconnected ecosystem that has been long dominated by a small minority to amass grotesque wealth at the expense of families, workers, and the natural world. We have a responsibility to respond to this crisis and meet those needs and inequities and injustices head on to create a stronger and more resilient planet and people. Our response to this crisis must center racial equity. And as shown in these maps, race-based policies like redlining have locked in poverty and pollution, which a health crisis like COVID-19 exploited to spread disease and death. Next slide, please. In this country, race plays a big role in determining winners and losers due to our long-standing practice of establishing and upholding race-based policies that consistently benefit white people over everyone else. The result, in this case of COVID-19, has been deadly, with Blacks disproportionately accounting for the most amount of deaths and Latinos accounting for the most cases. Next slide, please. And it's no surprise to see the COVID-19 data come back in the way that it has, because for far too long, Black and Brown communities have been first hit and worst hit by social, economic, health, and natural tragedies. We know that race is the most significant predictor of a person living near contaminated air, water, and soil. And we know that the racial wealth gap in the United States has consistently remained high and is only predicted to get worse as in the coming years. Next slide. The reason for these disparities is due to the fact that as a country, we have never really fully confronted our racist past, which in turn has accumulated and compounded inequities in our society. To truly address the disparities of our current society, we must acknowledge and understand how colonization, slavery, prejudice, discrimination, racism, sexism, and othering have permeated all facets of our society, economy, and institutions. Not addressing the root causes of today's disparities simply shoves them under the rug, only to reemerge in vicious ways, as we've seen through the COVID-19 pandemic. Government created these injustices, and so government must also play an important role in solving them. Next slide, please. Before discussing with you our proposal to begin to address these disparities systematically in California, I wanted to share Greenlining's racial equity definition. For us, racial equity is the practice of transforming the behaviors, institutions, and systems that disproportionately harm people of color. Equity means increasing access to power, redistributing and providing additional resources, and eliminating barriers to opportunity in order to empower low-income communities of color to thrive and reach full potential. Now, it's important that I share this definition with you because for Greenlining, this definition helps us to collectively design strategies, programming, advocacy to reach this outcome. For the Office of Racial Equity, it'll be imperative that we have clarity about the type of equity we want to pursue and the type of equity we want to practice as a state, which is going to be important as we head into the description of what our proposal is about. Next slide, please. Now that you know about the type of equity that we're thinking about in relationship to the Office of Racial Equity, I'd like to share what our proposal is. I'll begin by describing that we imagine the lead of this office to be a secretary level position that could be peers with other key agencies in the state. We imagine that this office would be in charge of developing a racial equity framework for the state and a plan of action that includes an assessment of current efforts of racial equity, goals, activities, and deliverables and procedures. This office would oversee the development of agency-specific racial equity plans and identify existing policies and practices in the state that contribute to, uphold, or exacerbate racial disparities and develop proposals to address these disparities. This office would also analyze and report on policies in the areas of housing, land use, employment, environment, economic security, public health, and public safety that may have an impact on racial equity and racial disparities. And it would create a budget equity assessment tool to determine whether budget requests and annual allocations benefit or burden communities of color. The Office of Racial Equity would be California's lead agency in our work to address the root causes of our disparities. Next slide, please. In putting this proposal together, we spoke to leaders of racial equity offices in various jurisdictions, including Oakland, San Francisco, and Portland, as well as folks who are currently doing racial equity work within the state of California. And from those conversations, they shared with us some things that the Office of Racial Equity must do and certain things that it must avoid. Number one, it must be a change entity. Bureaucracy is not inherently racist, but we need to invest to undo racist bureaucracy. And that's really one of the principal goals of this proposal. Number two, this office must have a framework that is guiding all of the work that the state is trying to promote. And equity, as we've seen, can become somewhat of an empty promise. The Office of Racial Equity must have a strong framework to prevent equity washing. This office must have accountability and authority. Someone needs to establish a standard and uphold that standard that everybody else is measured against. And it's important that there is that accountability and authority behind this office. Now, this office must not be the end-all be-all of equity in state government. It's not an agency that's intended to grow and grow. It's really intended to be a teacher so that everyone in state government becomes an equity practitioner. This office also can't focus on quick wins. There's no silver bullet here. The goal is always to reduce and close disparities, and we need to show progress along the way, but it can't just focus on a quick win. And finally, of course, this office can't go unfunded. We need a lot of equity infrastructure built into the state, and appropriate funding needs to be accompanied by it. Next slide, please. So in the short term, we would love to see out of this process an executive order indicating to Californians that this is a deep commitment of the state and that we are on the path towards establishing a racial equity office. Medium term, this executive order will signal to other branches of state government and departments the governor's priorities to help align, assess, and coordinate the work to root out institutional racism. And long term, this office will take a coordinated approach within state government to advance, identify racial disparities, develop strategies to reduce them, and eliminate these disparities. This is through this process that we've done for the task force, but of course, there's other avenues to trying to establish a racial equity office. I think the goal here is to try to be able to cement this in our state family. And with that, I'll pass it over to Sona.
So we're going to go ahead and transition to the second presentation that focuses on equitable green investments. And I will now turn it over to Tiffany Wong from Scope to kick us off.
Thanks, Sona. So yeah, we'll be taking a deep dive into green investments as a key just recovery strategy for California. Green investments must meet a triple bottom line of creating genuine economic stimulus, delivering tangible improvements to community health and resilience, and supporting communities hit hardest by COVID and the climate crisis, which we've seen is predominantly working class communities of color being hit first and worst. The first topic we'll be discussing are guiding principles that should be included in any program or funding opportunity to meet a triple bottom line, especially in our COVID response. The second topic is investing in community-driven planning and development to transform neighborhoods into healthy, thriving, and resilient green zones. The third topic will cover how we can innovate for disaster resilience, including utility debt relief, clean energy solutions, and community-based emergency response. The fourth topic will be integrating nature-based solutions, such as urban greening and urban forestry, to ensure all communities have access to trees and green space and their benefits. These topics demonstrate better approaches for a just recovery. They include existing state programs, as well as nascent or non-existent programs that we see as important investments. We'll have breakout discussions for each of these topics after the presentation. So please indicate which topic you want to join by adding the corresponding number in front of your name. You can look at my name as an example. I'll be in breakout number 2 and have a 2 in front of my name on the Zoom box. And we'll copy and paste the topics into the chat box so you can take a look during the presentation. Next slide. So first, in our letter, we offered 5 guiding principles to ensure equitable outcomes. The first principle is that investments must be targeted to and significantly meet the needs of communities most impacted by pollution and climate change. Without specific allocation, investments are not guaranteed to reach those most in need, and benefits may not trickle down. This is why investments must go directly to the people most impacted. This principle is crucial in our COVID response because we've seen that these same communities are being hit hardest by the health and economic impacts of the COVID pandemic. The second principle is that investments must uplift community-driven solutions. Without inclusive and meaningful community engagement, local and state leaders will fail to understand and adequately address the needs of the most vulnerable and impacted communities. Often, communities are only informed about planned activities rather than recognized as experts needed in all phases to shape, collaborate on, and have decision-making power over solutions. As more planning processes move to virtual spaces due to COVID, greater attention must be given to adequate notice, clear procedures, and technology and language access needs. And the third principle is that investments must do no further harm to impacted communities already facing significant socioeconomic, environmental, and health burdens. For example, investment into historically disinvested communities may increase property values, which may further displace local residents and businesses already in precarious conditions, especially during this COVID pandemic. Program and funding opportunities should require strong anti-displacement provisions and other protections. The fourth principle is that investments must deliver comprehensive solutions that connect public health, environmental, and economic opportunities. Frontline communities suffer from the cumulative impacts, and often policies and programs addressing each issue. Often policies and programs address each issue in isolation. This can overlook root causes and factors that may exacerbate the impacts of pollution. During the current pandemic, we need to prioritize approaches that address multiple issues and sectors at once. And lastly, investments must include adequate funding for capacity building and technical assistance to ensure equitable access to programs and funding opportunities. This is crucial because impacted communities may have less capacity and resources to develop and implement extensive grant proposals, especially during the COVID pandemic of many community-based organizations playing multiple roles. Capacity building and technical assistance are often overlooked assets that can significantly level the playing field for under-resourced communities. And as Alvaro mentioned, to truly put these principles into action, they must be embedded into a program's goals, processes, implementation, and evaluation. Next 2 slides. So racist land use planning, bad policy decisions, and cumulative impacts have left working class communities of color most vulnerable to COVID and climate change. In this current moment, this bears the question of what does health and safety mean if communities are not developed with that as a priority. In communities like South LA, where Scope organizes and is pictured above, people are sheltering in place from COVID, but living with daily exposure to pollution from nearby oil drilling or freeways. Folks don't have access to parks and shade to escape the heat, and this lack of green space further intensifies heat waves. And communities have no guaranteed right to housing and basic utilities, but are expected to stay inside and survive on low wages and little to no income assistance. Next slide, please. So this green investment area is focused on investing in community health and development, particularly place-based, community-driven, and multi-benefit strategies. It's critical that those most affected are defining and shaping the solutions that can create long-term transformative change. This means this green investment area meets a triple bottom line by building the capacity of frontline communities to shape the outcomes they want to see, invest in greenhouse gas reducing projects that improve community health and climate resilience, and integrates workforce development and economic opportunities for residents. Currently, there are 2 existing state programs that help facilitate this type of green investment: the Transformative Climate Communities Program, or TCC, and the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, or AFIC. Next slide, please. The Transformative Climate Communities Program is one of the only programs that provides multiple resources to impacted communities to cultivate green zones. And so as defined and developed by the California Environmental Justice Alliance, green zones are place-based strategies to transform communities on the front lines of poverty and pollution into healthy, thriving, and resilient neighborhoods. Green zones are founded on community-led planning, comprehensive solutions, cumulative impact tools, and collaborations, which are all key programmatic elements of TCC, as outlined in the slide. And central to TCC is a participatory community planning and implementation process that builds the capacity of community members and puts decision-making power in their hands. In the context of South LA, established community-based organizations working on tenant rights, economic growth, green space, and youth development have come together to create a community engagement and leadership development model that cultivates grassroots leaders. And based on each community's needs and vision for development, TCC can deliver comprehensive solutions that address cumulative impacts, such as improving air quality and health outcomes, increasing access to affordable housing, building climate resilience, creating career pathways for residents facing historical employment barriers, and mitigating the risk of displacement. And to ensure these direct and meaningful benefits, the TCC program provides separate planning and implementation grants, technical assistance, and allows a percentage of implementation grant funding for community engagement, displacement avoidance, and workforce and economic opportunities. Next slide, please. The Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program is another one that invests in multi-benefit solutions in frontline communities. And this invests in coordinated affordable housing, land use, and transportation developments that increase connectivity to jobs, reduce air pollution, and build climate resilience, and integrate workforce development strategies. And on the slide, you can see that these are other key elements of the ESSEC program. If you'd like to join this breakout group to just further discuss, you can add a 2 in front of your name. And now I'll be passing to Ami, who will be sharing about innovating for disaster resilience.
Thanks, Tiffany. The next green investment sort of area is around innovating for disaster resilience. And as we know, California right now is being pushed to extremes. And the record heat, fires, and pollution all have one thing in common. They were made worse by climate change. Next slide, Sona. Sorry, one back. Great. So the scientists say we've lost complete control and there isn't a normal anymore. And that when you add these crises all together, the impact is cumulative. But as Tiffany mentioned, for environmental justice communities plagued with the burden of our polluting industries for generations, there is nothing new about cumulative health burdens. Traditional models of crisis response, however, are proving deeply inadequate. They're coordinated through militarized entities like sheriff's departments. They rely upon protocols like evacuating to faraway sites. They share alerts in 1 or 2 languages, and they require people to present ID to access services. These types of policies collectively shut out many people from the support they need. Next slide. So this picture is grim, but there are new possibilities in this moment. Through historic disinvestment and deep systemic failure, our communities have had to be incredibly resilient. And now they are organizing for change and innovating local models for crisis response. In some places, neighbors have formed mutual aid networks and to share resources. Schools are providing food to families, and public libraries are turning into cooling and air respite centers. The examples that follow for this section and the ones that we reflected in our letter really meet our triple bottom line by addressing needs arising from both the pandemic alongside climate disasters. They deliver culturally specific interventions, and they invest in the social infrastructure already embedded in our neighborhoods. Next slide. I want to start with models for community-based responses and transformation. Just yesterday, APEN jointly released a new report with SEIU California and the Blue-Green Alliance, recommending that our policymakers invest in community-driven social infrastructure. This includes resilience hubs, spaces where communities gather, organize, and access social services, not only during disasters, but on a daily basis. One example is the RISE Youth Center, which APEN is collaborating with to become an innovative model for youth-led governance. And once complete, will provide a safe space for healing, community health services, and other youth programs as part of its expansion. Next slide. We are also pushing for technology solutions through distributed clean energy systems, such as energy efficiency and weatherization, rooftop solar, storage, and microgrids, which we know are all powerful resilience tools that can reduce harm from power outages, improve ventilation amidst wildfire smoke, and offer relief from extreme heat, in addition to offering economic savings. And in the face of growing wildfires, this infrastructure is drastically needed for working class communities of color and community institutions like RISE. Next slide. And finally, the last sort of set of interventions I want to highlight as part of innovating for disaster resilience is around debt relief, specifically for utilities. Amidst all these extreme conditions overlapping with shelter in place, we also have to ensure that we have reliable access to cooling, refrigeration for medicine and food, and charging for devices as in our homes, especially for folks with disabilities and people who are medically dependent. And so in our letter, we demanded that utilities and service providers forgive customer debt accrued during the crisis and minimize rate increases to mitigate the harms from shutoffs and support economic stability. So that is sort of the set of examples for disaster resilience. And I'm going to pass it over to Mariela to talk about integrating nature-based solutions.
Hi everyone, again, I'm Mariela. So here I have some definitions and images so that we all have an understanding of what we're talking about when it comes to green infrastructure. Basically, it's all the trees, green space within your communities, such as local parks, school playgrounds, street trees, and landscape when on your walking trails, and residential yards and gardens, lawns, and drought-tolerant plants. In the next slide, you will see the next slide. You will see the chronic canopy inequities due to redlining, as Alvaro talked about earlier. These two images are communities in the Bay Area 2 miles away from each other. The lush green one is Peat Mound, which is predominantly white. The gray one is Oakland, which is predominantly Black and Hispanics. As you can see, from Cal EnviroScreen 3.0, residents living in the Oakland census tract are exposed to high pollution levels compared to the Piedmont residents. And then in fact, Cal EnviroScreen ranks one of them, West Oakland, as one of the most challenging places to live in California, while Piedmont is ranked as one of the most comfortable. And this is not a special case. You can see this throughout the whole state. And then in the next slide, you will see that disadvantaged and low-income communities not only have suffered from environmental problems, but due to climate change, these have been impacted by other factors such as extreme heat. This summer, we all heard that Death Valley set a record high of 130 degrees. So here I took a map from chat, the California Heat Assessment Tool. The tool is used to forecast heat health events, meaning an increase of temperature that results in a negative public health impact. So we take a look at Fresno and the surrounding area. The Central Valley, which already experiences extreme heat, is expected to experience even more in the coming year due to climate change. And then if you look back at the map of the state, you can see a lot of other inland communities that will also be exposed to 4 or more heat health events, which can cause more adverse human health impact and mortality. Okay, and the next slide. So COVID and the shelter in place order have exposed many issues these communities are facing, which were further illustrated by Avro in his discussion. For example, poor air quality makes people more vulnerable to COVID. Extreme heat makes it difficult for people to stay indoors due to the shelter in place order. When they don't have an energy efficient home, or the ability to venture outdoors when wildfire smoke is creating the worst air quality in the world, as reported earlier this year. And access to local parks could improve people's well-being to face stressful situations as we are all facing today. So in addition to all the solutions Ami and Tiffany talked about, nature-based solutions are critical to helping DACs and LICs effectively respond to increasing harmful climate conditions and meet the triple bottom line. These solutions help improve air quality, mitigate heat, give people access to nature, help people build a sense of community, and can be used as a tool for resocietizing people as the state opens. So if you would like to join the breakout group to discuss this topic, please add a 4 in front of your name, your Zoom name. So next slide. So lastly, we can go over programs during the breakout groups that are currently used for green investments, such as TCC, ASIC, low-income weatherization, youth community access, urban greening, the urban and community forestry program, while also answering questions and opening up for discussion. Now I'm just going to turn it over to Sona.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, Ami, and Mariela for that presentation. I know there was a lot of content to go over, and so just want to make sure that all of our participants here know how all of this content relates to you and to your work. So just wanted to share some goals with our green investment priorities. In the short term, we want to share priorities for equitable green investments and learn about your organization's priorities. In the medium term, we plan to collect all of our priorities and make sure that we're sharing them with people who can resource and implement the different ideas, like with legislative offices, state agencies, and the governor's office. And in the long term, we hope to identify different opportunities to advance our collective priorities, such as through a new tax measure or legislation. So to close out, I first want to just quickly share the dates again for the 2 other town halls we'll be hosting. We really hope you'll be able to join us for these. The next one is in 2 weeks on October 6th, and the last one will be a month from now on October 20th, and we'll be sending reminder emails for registration for those. I also wanted to let everyone know that we'll be sharing the key takeaway documents with all of you, the slides and a recording of the presentations, as well as a sign-up sheet to see if you're interested in working with us on any of these topics moving forward. And with that, I just want to say thank you so much for your time, for your energy, and for spending your morning with us. And again, huge thanks to all of our incredible speakers today for sharing some really rich knowledge. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and yeah, take care.